wait. And baby, I'm TFC till I die.
It's been a while, but hello and welcome back to Toronto Till I Die, the Toronto FC fan show. Flashing lights, sirens everywhere, emergency pod for the big news on this Canada Day. First of all, happy Canada Day to all the listeners and viewers out there. But the big news of the day, Cassius Mailula is returning to Toronto FC after a loan. And no, obviously that is not the big news of the day. Of course, the big news of the day, TFC breaking through Tom Bogert at Gimme Sport, announcing that both Lorenzo Insigne and Federico Bernardeschi have mutually agreed to part ways. MLS parlance, it really means buyout for both DPs for Toronto FC. So the Italian experiment at Toronto FC is over. With me to talk about it today are my co-hosts, Michael Singh and Sean, a.k.a. Canadian Footy Guy. Sean, thanks for joining. Mr. Singh, good to see you again, as normal. Let's just jump right into this, because obviously this is massive news for TFC fans. I think a day a lot of people saw coming. Maybe not exactly the way they thought it would happen, but I mean, I think for most of all, from what I'm seeing out there, positive day for Toronto FC, at least in terms of how fans are feeling. But love to get your thoughts on it, gentlemen. Guest today, Sean, let's start with you.
Well, as soon as I saw that, I was excited. I think the first person I messaged was Noel. So shout out Noel from the Tunnel Club. We touched on it actually on the last show that, maybe something is happening behind the scenes with both of them being missing from the lineup. So it's news that I think a lot of us wanted, especially when it comes to Insigne. I think that was the sign, like we kind of said, like enough is enough. Let's move on. Let's get a buyout. Like do what you have to do. I think the Fede moving will be a little. I won't say he'll be missed, but I don't think we saw that one coming as obviously as the other one. But I think it's good that we finally moved on from this experiment.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's been a long time coming, I think, for Toronto FC fans, and for the club as well. The thing that I immediately thought of, and we had spoken about this right after, was when Jason Hernandez did his press conference. I believe it was either end of season or to introduce Robin Fraser alongside Keith Pelley, and they talked about the need to enact a culture in the club itself, right? He had mentioned specifically, like, when Greg Vanney was here, that was the culture. When Greg Vanney left, it switched over to Ali Curtis and Chris Armas and what they wanted to impose, that Red Bull philosophy. And then when Bob Bradley came, it switched over to Bob Bradley. But the club itself didn't really have that culture. But the reality is the club could not have its culture and cannot get that culture until both Insigne and Bernardeschi, in my opinion, were gone. Because as long as both of those guys were there, they were the culture that was Toronto FC. And it was, as we know it, a very toxic culture. So, as you guys pointed out, Sean, you pointed out, Insigne is not really that big of a surprise. In terms of the fact that they wanted to move on from him. Bernardeschi raises a bit of a few more eyebrows, but at the end of the day, these guys, whether fair or unfair, were a bit of a package deal here and really played a big role in creating the culture that was Toronto FC over the past 3-4 seasons. So I think overall, Canada Day, happy Canada Day to Toronto FC fans, and it's a positive day for the club as they're finally able to move forward.
Yeah, and I wonder and again, for those watching live, I'd love to get your thoughts, so please comment on this. But what do you think their legacy is going to be at TFC? I mean, two players that, like you said, Michael, are linked together, package deal, whatever you want to call that, but two very different experiences in Toronto. One never really got off the ground, and the other kind of had a bit of a redemption arc. We've talked about it quite a bit on this show for Federico Bernardeschi. And I think somebody in the end, fans ended up taking to a bit. But what do you think their legacy at the end of the day is going to be when Toronto FC remember this era of the club?
Failure, right? Because they are a package deal and they were hyped together and this big, Italian movement when we brought them in, it goes down as a failure. We didn't succeed. We didn't get any, we had flashes last year of what might be with regard to Fede, but let's be real, as a whole, it was a failure. We had losing season after losing season. They didn't make the playoffs. We weren't, did we win any trophies with them? Maybe no. No Canadian championship. So there's no success from having them. It's a failure. That's my take.
Yeah, I think we won one, at least the COVID Canadian championship that was replayed.
Okay, I think, yeah.
That was at least the trophy that they won. I don't believe they won another one. No, look, I agree with you, Sean. You're absolutely right. Especially Lorenzo Insigne. Lorenzo Insigne is going to go down as the most hated player in Toronto FC history.
Worst DP signing.
That's pretty tough. I mean, considering how many people really hate Jermaine Defoe, that's impressive. Yeah.
But at least Jermaine Defoe still produced. Insigne didn't. In his in that short window we had Jermaine, there was something there. Insigne, the whole time he was there, was a waste man, plain and simple. Door kick you out on your way out. Fede, at least, he gave it in an effort. He was into the city. He was people. There was a connection there, but unfortunately, because they're tied together, it was that Italian project that our former president decided he wanted to do, not in cohesion with the new coach that you're bringing in with the management group. This was all on him, right? So it was a bad deal from day one. The COVID title, great, but we had no real success. So to me, that's a failure.
For sure, absolute failure. And I will say, I think Fede, people are going to look at Fede more fondly than Insigne. I think Fede, while he was very joyful and lovable on camera, I think there were plenty of instances off camera and behind the scenes where it was the complete opposite.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get to.
So much passion. He does, you see it when he plays, right? This guy worked harder than anyone else on the pitch every single time he stepped on the pitch. And I think that's what we asked for as Toronto FC fans. That's what we, at least could be okay with. If you're on the pitch, you're giving it your all. I think TFC fans will at the very least, have a baseline amount of respect for you, right?
Yeah.
Sure, we can talk results, 8 goals, 8 assists last season, on pace for about the same thing. It's okay, especially when you're playing, as a wing back, when you're putting in the amount of defensive effort that you're doing. You could have lived with Federico Bernardeschi as a DP in MLS. So I think TFC fans, and especially as you mentioned, what he did around the city and how he embraced Toronto, I think they'll definitely respect him more. And I think, honestly, if things had gone differently and he produced a bit more, he'd be the most lovable athlete, in probably pretty close to club history, quite frankly, if he was able to produce, right? Obviously, he had some pretty good legends there, but I think Fede had everything to potentially even get to that level.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, for me, the legacy will be complicated for Bernardeschi because, yes, he had the redemption arc, and for sure, I think he took some lessons from that first full season. But I'm never going to forget the Athletic article. I'm never going to forget our conversation with Paul Tenorio here on this show about that article and what they uncovered, and the fact that the two of them tried to lead a mutiny, against the manager, whether you agreed or liked Bob Bradley or not. There is a level of decorum and professionalism that, you expect out of players and your two most highly paid players. And, it's just not something I'm going to forget, right? I can forgive a little bit, but you're never going to forget it. And I think that, to me, will always be the legacy, was that when push came to shove, these guys divided a locker room. They didn't really unite it that much. And I agree with you, Michael, in the sense that the social media posts with Federico Bernardeschi are great, but clearly this is a guy who really thinks about his image and thinks about how he projects to fans. If you just look at his social, even his goodbye message today that he posted on Instagram. Look, it obviously he loved the city. That is true. But at the same time, like, you are playing the game very much. And I think that's what I'm going to think about with Federico Bernardeschi is like, could have been really great, could have been a great leader, but in the end of the day, never really produced that. Like there's the on the field stuff, and then there's the off the field stuff, and I just can't ignore that.
Yeah, totally. The results, especially results, right? Had he been scoring, had he been producing, nobody really cares what he's like off the field, to be completely honest with you. Right? If Fede is joyful in front of the camera, no one's questioning what he's actually like behind the scenes, right? No one's talking about him vaping on planes or whatever it would be, right? If he was actually producing, or at least no one cares about it as much. But he wasn't living up to the price tag on the field. And I think, a few instances off the field also absolutely sent the wrong message. So, yeah, I mean, it's tough to say differently or argue differently. I think this was a move that had to be done. But yeah, let's speak about that a little bit, I guess, Mike. Like, why now for Toronto FC? Why do you guys think Toronto FC decided today, July 1st, that they were going to announce the buyouts of Insigne and Bernardeschi?
Yeah, Sean, you want to take that?
Earlier in the season?
I thought I saw a tweet about it. It had something to do with the financials of calendar year with regard to the league, that similar to what happens in Europe with June 30th ending, and then the new fiscal year begins July 1st. I could be wrong, but I did see a tweet with regard to that. So maybe that has a factor.
Yeah, that was around MLSC's overall fiscal year. I don't know if that's true at all. There's no confirmation on that. Why now? I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one, oddly enough, you're kind of doing the players a favor. The European window's about to open. There's already rumors about Federico Bernardeschi potentially signing for Bologna, which is going to be very interesting, considering who owns the team. And for Lorenzo, who knows what the next move is? I think now maybe being in the Turkish Super League, even if you're at the bottom of the table, might sound pretty interesting at the moment. I don't know who's going to be in the market for him. He's going to sign somewhere. But where exactly and at what level, who knows? So there's that. I think there's the other factor of, you're coming into the second half of the season. The international window is about to end, at least from a Gold Cup perspective. Canada's out right now, so you get Richie back at least. So now you get an opportunity and a runway to see what you really have with some of these younger players, with some of these players on loan. Robin Fraser mentioned this at the press conference after Saturday's win, which, by the way, the most complete 90 minutes Toronto FC has played maybe since the 4-0 win against Charlotte when the two debuted. I'm being pretty serious about that. Like, even the 5-1 win against Montreal away, the red card was in it, and that influenced it a lot. But he talked about, like, really giving players a chance. And, you're starting to see some of the TFC2 guys get more minutes and come up and make debuts. Now, that was partly due to injuries and needing to fill space. But, for Robin Fraser, this is an opportunity to really say, like, this is my team now. Like, I get to actually figure out who I've got, figure out who a core is that I want. And this is right now perfect for Toronto FC. They get 2 DP spots that open up. I don't think you should use them in this window. I think there's a question here from the listeners saying, at least we can start a rebuild now. Yes, this is a time where you could potentially start a rebuild. You have time, going through the summer window where I don't know how active they're really going to be during this window, but you have time now between this window and opening up to the off-season window to really start to figure out what is the real plan here. because no matter what they talked about in the offseason about finding an identity and who are we and how are we going to play, I don't know if that's fully been established yet. And I don't know if you could fully establish it with both of those guys on the team. Now that they're gone, you have the rampway to do that. I doubt they make a run this year, so don't worry about 2025 other than to see who's going to step up and who's going to have opportunities to move forward. But we'd love to get your guys' thoughts on it too.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's more dominoes to fall. And that's the thing is I think this is the start of the rebuild now. It's a matter of, all right, I think there's going to be a couple players that are going to be sold. So, I think it makes sense if you're really looking to the future, give these young. Are they worth spending more money on? I'm hoping the team is willing, like if they do have an idea of keep bringing some of these players back, don't bring them back on a raise. Some of them are going to, maybe bring them back on a 1 year where like a one and one where if you hit certain metrics, you'll bump up that pay. But we've already got some guys that are already overpaid. So either shop them during this window and let's see what we can do to move them out. And, that's kind of where my head's at right now.
Yeah, I mean, so first off, I think the reason why they chose today, part of it, yeah, I'm sure financially and some of the bookkeeping perhaps. But more than anything, I think they didn't want to drag this on any longer. And I think they were able to reach an agreement with both Insigne and Bernardeschi that was better and more stomachable than it was in the past. Right? I think they explored this option at the very least with Insigne early on. And as we know, as we discussed, Insigne wanted every single penny from Toronto FC and MLSC. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think there was a deal that was agreed upon that did not pay Insigne 100% of the wages that were owed. However, you're still talking about a significant amount. Whatever that is, that amount doesn't really mean anything to the club now, right? It doesn't mean anything to us. He was a DP, free up a DP spot. They're not going to go invest that, extra, whatever it is into, their next DP signing. Their next DP signing is going to be their next DP signing regardless of the price tag. Now, what it means moving forward is, okay, culturally, like I said, they can try to find that identity. But, you mentioned Robin Fraser now being able to cook a little bit. Jason Hernandez can now cook.
Yeah.
Right? Not only is he going to have two free DP spots moving forward, and I do believe if the right player becomes available, that Toronto FC will pull the trigger, not necessarily to make an impact this year, but if you have the right player available, you pull the trigger. Just
fair,
because, right? It's July. It's way easier to sign players in this summer transfer window than it is come January. It's very seldom where those guys are out of contract at that point anyways. So you're looking at more likely paying transfer fees or having to wait until next year. So if the right player or players do become available, I wouldn't be surprised if TFC do pull the trigger on something. You have to, DPs are so important. So it's not like TFC are not going to get DPs anymore. Are they going to be of the stature of Insigne, Bernardeschi? Are they going to need the price tags? No. But are they going to try to find the next Pozuelo again, or try to find, even the next Josie, or even, Michael Seba, right? Lesser extents, perhaps, right? They could still be players in that. But you look at TFC's roster composition, and there's only 8 players who are signed beyond this season.
Yeah.
8 players. And I would say 4 of those guys are, reserve players, young players, really. So you're really looking at like a Jonathan Osorio or Richie Larea, technically Cassius Mayula. Let's see what happens with him, though. I have a hard time imagining him not moving on somewhere else this summer. You're looking at like Alonso Coelho and Luca Gavrin and Zane Monlouis and Henry Wingo, right? Those guys. So you're not talking about, you're talking about guys who can still play roles for this team, absolutely, but you're not. You're essentially, you got a lot of runway here and a lot of blueprint to fill if you're Jason Hernandez. So we've talked a lot about how he's had to undo a lot of the work by previous, regimes. Now it's time for Jason Hernandez to kind of step up, and it's going to be a little bit tougher this summer because cap space wise, they're quite limited.
Yeah.
They
don't get they don't get the relief from the
They
cap
do.
because they do for both.
They do get
Okay.
the relief for both, and they get the slots available for both.
Okay.
Because MLS increased that buyout number to 2. So as long as they did it before the end of the secondary transfer window, they do get the slots and the relief for both. But beyond that, they have $0 in cap space. So they'll get the whatever the DP cap hit is.
It's like
I think it's
4
6
or something. Is it like 4.5 or like 6?
Yeah, I think it's like 6.5, but cut in half, something along those lines, or 7.5, something like that. Whatever the max roster slot is, cut in half. So 50% of that. So if they don't use a DP slot, they'll have about 700K to 800K to play with beyond that this season. So stuff to factor in. There still is room to really build, but really next off season is when you're going to see this team really change over and completely shift its identity from what it has been.
So then the question I have for you guys is, okay, the window's going to open up in a couple of weeks here. And, TFC come off an impressive 3-0 win over Portland. As I said, it was probably the most complete 90 minutes we've seen this team play in a long time. No one's thinking playoffs, but we're sort of thinking about how do you start the building blocks to get yourself back to being just respectable from that perspective. Do you think TFC need to go into the market and sort of at least fill one of those DP spots this summer? Is that something you think is maybe a priority for Toronto FC, or is it more like, hey, let's just wait. We've got the spots. We can really do some due diligence on some players that we may have on the scouting radar, and maybe wait and see if they actually become available at that time. What do you think?
Depending. I mean, I'm sure there's been work that's been done since really last off season, when the possibility of buying out Insigne was actually on the table. While they didn't reach an agreement, I'm sure there were still backup plans, A, B, C, and D to fill that spot. So I still think that is on the table. I feel like they've had their eyes on people for, very long time. It's just a matter of whether or not they believe this is the right person at the right price. Because timing wise, honestly, I don't think it really matters whether they do it this season or next season. DPs are your building blocks, right? They're not necessarily meant to be complementary players. You can complement the roster afterwards, right? Use the other mechanisms to complement the rosters. You're going to have 2 to 3 under 22 initiatives roster slots as well, right? These are things that TFC haven't really utilized in the past enough. So they have a lot of different ways they can build that roster. And I honestly think some of the most important pieces is getting in those DP pieces, but don't force it too. Like, again, it goes without saying, but don't force it. I think you're muted, Sean.
Yeah, we might have some audio issues with Sean there. Keep trying there, but I think you might be muted. Try again.
No,
Here we go.
I would reload.
There you go.
Oh, there we go.
All right. Sorry about that. What I'll say is, if the right player comes along, that's worth it. That's worth us, going after and saying it's a no-brainer when it comes to the DP slot. He's going to be part of our long-term strategy. He's the right fit for what the management and coaching staff want with regard to the structure. Go for it. Otherwise, there's no pressure on them, right? We're not in a playoff position. We're not, in a scenario where, that DP signing is going to take us to that next level right now, right? So there's no rush for me. Like, again, if it's the right player, he's going to be an asset. He's the right, his attitude and personality is going to fit with regard to bringing in the right people for the locker room. Again, it's a no-brainer. Otherwise, let's not rush this decision.
Fair enough. And here's a question from Nathan here. Says, any concern that it's Jason Hernandez, he gets to choose new players. Not exactly a fan of the current regime at Toronto FC. I am of probably the minority camp that thinks that Jason Hernandez has actually done a somewhat decent job in terms of the cards that he's been dealt and doing what he needs to do. I know not everybody agrees with that, but I wonder your thoughts on Jason Hernandez's performance, I guess, for lack of a better term, as general manager so far, and now with another critical offseason coming, another critical summer window opening, and now 2 DP slots that have been opened up. Is he the guy to make the right decisions here? I have my views, but again, would love to get your guys' thoughts on that.
I don't know about that one. I think I'm not sold on him. And I've kind of said this in the past. I feel he has potential to be a good GM. I just think he's young, and I just worry that he's not experienced enough with regard to negotiating contracts, with regard to, finding the right talent. Again, this is his first big role as a GM, and I just don't know if he's the right one who can bring us to that next stage. I'm not saying get rid of him, because right now with our current situation, I really don't know who else you could bring in. I think they might have the right people around him to help him. It seems like they brought in a few players or former players and a few other people to kind of guide him, but I just don't know. I'm not sold on him long term.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's been given a real shot yet, right? I think he had to play within the confines of what this roster was, and it didn't really allow him to showcase too much of what he can bring to the table. I thought his first year as GM, he had an excellent, debut year, let's call it. I thought he made some really savvy moves, especially when you look at the price that they're paying for certain players. And we always talk about it in really every salary cap sport. The way to find success is to find players who can outplay their cap hit, right? If you're bringing more value than what you're being, what is attributed to you on the books, then you are going to be, you're going to find you're going to be successful, right? And I thought that he brought in quite a few players that were able to bring that. You still look at someone like a Nixon Gomes and his contract being paid $70K still this year. I mean, obviously he's out with injury and an unfortunate injury, but that was a guy that was playing like a $1 million player at some points and sometimes. So, I thought he did well to find moves like that and do moves like that. I thought this year was a bit of a struggle, right? I don't think you can look at every single move that he made and you can single out one move that is like a home run. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I see it. Like maybe Zane Monlouis, because it's kind of like a similar ilk to Nixon Gomes, but he hasn't really been able to show that he can play like Nixon Gomes. So I thought this year was a struggle, but again, like you're playing within certain confines and certain restrictions, and once he's able to actually spend money and actually bring in players who could be impactful players, I wonder if we see better results. I think the only really impactful player, let's call it, with a significant cap hit that he's brought in would be Ulla Brynhildsen, and I think the jury is still kind of out on Ulla, right? I think he's battled some injuries. Obviously, he's shown flashes. Really has lacked the consistency. He's not DP level from what I've seen so far, but does he have the potential to be? Maybe. But yeah, that's kind of where I stand. I still don't think we've seen enough out of Jason, so we got to give him an opportunity.
Fair enough, but I think also like you with those moves, he has insulated the club from any like real risk. Like these guys are on loan, most of them,
Exactly.
Right? So if they don't work out, yes, okay, of course you don't want to tank a season per se on that, but at the same time, like if they don't work out, you just don't sign them, right? Like and you let them go.
And that's his credit. That's also what he had to do too.
Yeah,
based on
that is true.
The restriction, like Ulla, he couldn't buy because of the 3 DP restrictions. They didn't have that ability to do that, or didn't even have the cap space to potentially do something like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's credit to him. He's definitely had to make those moves knowing that at the end of the year, there's going to have to be more decisions made. They're going to have to really look at this roster and really rebuild this roster. And I imagine not a lot of people are going to come back. So, credit to him, but he's also had to do it that way because of this.
Last point here for the show, because I think like we've kind of gotten through some of the major points here in terms of this particular news item, but it has more to do with more of the overall MLSE structure and how this could relate to Toronto FC. Obviously, look, Keith Pelly has been going on a bit of a sacking spree lately. Brendan Shanahan gone at the Leafs. Masai Ujiri just being announced as leaving the Raptors. Obviously, there hasn't been a president filled at the Toronto FC role or at the Argos role. I guess Pinball Clemens kind of has that at the moment. How does this potentially impact sort of the decision-making process at Toronto FC going forward, right? Like, you have these two DPs. They're obviously signed by our former president, Bill Manning. Obviously the decision was made at the higher levels. A buyout at this level would have to be approved by Keith Pelly and the board. So how do you think this might impact Toronto FC going forward in terms of making splashes in the transfer market? Are the days of signing guys like, Lorenzo Insigne and Federico Bernardeschi maybe not as disastrous, but in terms of the money, is that over for Toronto FC? And are we more going into a more, I guess, typical MLS roster build mode, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I think so. But I think they're going to look for the next trend, if that makes sense. Like, there is, and we've spoken about this for a very long time, that the timing of Insigne and Bernardeschi would have been unbelievably cool 5 years prior to them signing, right?
Yeah.
Then when you look at where MLS is heading and the amount of eyes on Major League Soccer and the amount of transfers that are coming out the league, and teams in Europe buying players for kind of significant transfer fees, there is a lot more of a revenue stream that can be tapped into if you're a club, especially a club like Toronto FC, who, as we've spoken about, kind of sits on this gold mine when it comes to young Canadian players that are coming through the ranks. And there's a lot of ways that I think MLSC can look at Toronto FC as not only a valuable club when it comes to overall club value and brand and equity in that sense, but also as a potential revenue stream when it comes to developing players and selling on players and reinvesting that into the club. I think they have huge ambitions for Toronto FC in the sense that they want to do both. They want to compete for titles every single year, but they also want to drive revenue through selling players, which allows them to also unlock different mechanisms to invest more into that roster. But if you're spending more so in $1 million players, $1.5 million players, I think it's a lot less risk that the team takes on, and it doesn't lock themselves into these big contracts. So I think they will still spend. It's a long-winded way of me saying I think they will still spend. It'll just be in a different way.
Yeah, I don't see them spending anywhere near as big and going for that big overpriced splashy type of player. But I just don't even know like with what direction MLSE/Rogers is going to go into now, right? Because now, like I said, you have just Keith Pelly kind of overseeing everything. Is Ed Rogers going to want to have more of a footprint? Does he care about soccer at all? From that standpoint, like I understand it's a revenue generator for the organization, but how much do they want to invest in it, right? We see how little they invest in the other team that we share the stadium with. Like, could they just use that as, do little and hope they do get it, some kind of return?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time, not just on the pitch, but a lot off the pitch, because how that sort of network of decision making is, however that gets shaped at Toronto FC, it will affect a lot of what's going to be happening over the next, couple of months and obviously the next couple of seasons, whether they decide to get a president of football or stick with sort of the current model, which really has sort of Jason Hernandez, the technical director, and Keith Pelly kind of making decisions here on how to build the roster, spend money, what kind of players and what kind of profile of players they sign. Let's be real. We've talked about on this show. Sean, you guys have talked about it in the Tunnel Club. All the DP signings, when getting Lorenzo Insigne was about putting butts in seats, right, after the pandemic. And is that something they focus on again? Or is it more around, hey, let's find DPs that help us win, and helping you win then puts butts in seats, right? That there's a couple ways to look about it. I mean, if you look at Saturday, you wouldn't have really thought this team was, second bottom in the East. It was a pretty decent attendance night, and granted, it was a beautiful Saturday night in Toronto, and people always like to do stuff in the summer. But that's I think that's the thing. We're gonna have to figure it out, and with the sort of ownership shift, I won't say change because the owners are kind of the same, but it's just shifting. We'll see where Toronto FC sort of lands on the hierarchy on the totem pole, really.
Yeah.
Yep, I agree with that. I think they've learned, the best way to put butts in seats is to win. So whatever helps this team win, whether it is that player, whether it is investing in the right players, I think, I think it's going to be a while before we see another Insigne type signing at TFC.
Yeah, absolutely.
I got a question for both of you guys. So with
Sure.
this happening, our next home game is the 12th.
Yes.
What will the attendance be like on the 12th?
I'll be there.
Right? You will be there. Will there be a buzz in the fact that, they're gone? There's a new vibe with the team. Especially they have a game Thursday on the road.
It's a weird Thursday night game.
Yeah. If that things go well with that result, you could be on back-to-back wins coming back home. Could it be another close to sellout, right?
Yeah, look, again, like I said, if it's a beautiful Saturday night in Toronto, people will show up, right? It's whether, they are hardcore fans or, people who are just like, hey, it's, I can get these tickets relatively cheap and, off the secondary market and walk in the building and just have a fun night, right? I think look, if the attendance was going to be bad, I would be more concerned. I just think right now, fans are going to be in the vibe. That said, if you come out of this and, you end up losing a whole bunch of games, then you're going to have a lot of people sort of pointing at TFC and saying, hey, you let the DPs go, and now you're seeing this team tank a bunch of games. Maybe they stop showing up. I don't know. I would say this to any sort of casual fans who doesn't follow Toronto FC very closely, but at an arm's length and kind of has an idea. I think this is a good day for the club, long term, right? It doesn't seem that way because it seems counterintuitive to be letting two high-priced players who've won European championships and are when they're into it and fit, good players. But it is a positive day for the club. I think this is the chance to move on, to really sort of assess where this team is going to go, because I don't think we've really done that since Greg Vanney left. And I think it's also an opportunity for a lot of the club and a lot of the fans, honestly, to kind of let go of the old model of building a club, which is the 2017 go get 3 DPs that are sort of biggish names and build around them. I think it needs to now be the other way around. You build the club first, you find the core players first, and then you find DPs that are going to put you over the top. And I think that's been missing from Toronto FC for quite some time. And I think this is an opportunity now to go and do just that. And we'll see how that goes over the next couple of weeks, obviously as the transfer window opens and as we get closer to the end of the season. I think we'll wrap it up there, gentlemen. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Short notice on Canada Day. Great numbers, great banter in the chat. It's a big day for Toronto FC. We'll see how they respond. Yeah, Ryan, I don't disagree with you. We'll see how they respond. We will be back next week with a show to talk about the play on the pitch. They did play 2 games this week. And again, some positive things coming out of Saturday's match. So we'll talk about that next week. But for Michael Singh, for Sean Levy, I'm Mike Newell. Thank you for listening to Toronto Till I Die. We'll see you next week. Cheers, everybody.
Peace.
And wait, and baby, I'm TFC till I die.